Dobry wieczór. Witamy. Dzisiaj spotkaliśmy się, by porozmawiać o istocie sporu polsko-czechosłowackiego dotyczącego przynależności tych ziem po I wojnie światowej. Będziemy dyskutować w naszym zacnym gronie. Chciałbym przywitać pana Andrew Parka oraz Tomasza Luska i panią Irenę French. Spędzimy około pół godzinki, może godzinkę, zadając pytania na temat istoty tej sporu oraz dwóch komisji, które w ówczesnym czasie miały decydować o przynależności narodowościowej tych to właśnie ziem. Więc może nie zwlekając, oddam głos Tomaszowi, który będzie zadawał pytania panu Andrew. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Standa. Hello, Andrew. It's a pleasure to have you here in Skoczowie tonight, and we have prepared several questions for you. So obviously the first one is if you can briefly introduce yourself, your research, and what actually led you to the question of border disputes after the Great War.
Hi, Tomasz. Thank you. And thank you, Stanisław and Irina, for this impromptu event. This is actually more people listening to my research than I think ever. So this is great. In Hong Kong University, where I'm based, there's obviously less interest in Central European border disputes. They've got their own problems at the moment. But for me, why did I get interested in the Teschen dispute in 1919? I used to live in Warsaw when I was a teenager, 12 till 16, and I went to an international school. Unfortunately, my Polish is still not very good for that reason, but I was always interested in Polish history, Central Europe, for that reason. And then I was doing my master's degree in London at the LSE and was thinking of a topic and thought back to Poland, and I'd always been interested in Polish history, especially the time of independence, 1919, Piłsudski, so on. And my supervisor at the time was Dr. Anita Przemowska, who's also she's written a lot on interwar Polish history. And I think she encouraged me just to have a look at this field, and I found a few things on the Teschen dispute, but nothing really was written about this commission. And so this was 2010, 2011 when I started this research. And I looked into some archives in Britain. They were quite fascinating. And then I think, as some of you know, this account by Roy, James Roy, a very vivid account of his time in the commission. This was brilliant. It made it very, very real and vivid. And then I also read the papers by another member of this commission, Pakenham Walsh, the second British member, who wrote very, very touching letters about his time in the commission. So I wrote my master's thesis in 2011 on the commission, and then I didn't pursue this for a number of years. I worked in China for about 4 years in a project in a German organization related to climate change, so on and so forth. But the whole time I was always thinking about this, and I was preparing to get this thesis published. And I was told that, well, you would do well to find more sources than just British sources for this. So I had a chance in 2015 to go to Hong Kong to do a PhD. So I said, okay, perfect. So my PhD is not only on the Teschen crisis, but it's on this technique of international commissions as a form of peacekeeping. So I guess I could briefly describe that as well. I'm probably merging questions that you wanted to ask.
Feel free to continue.
Okay, my current research, which is in its final stage, I'm writing things up. Hopefully I'll be finished by March or so, looks at the year 1919 to 1956, which is the official UN date for the beginning of peacekeeping operations, the Suez Crisis, the United Nations Emergency Mission. And so I look at commissions and say that this is actually, this technique goes back much further and there's more institutionalization of this and so on. My thesis actually begins with the vignette, the story of this fake commission that Schneiderek sends to Teschen. And I start that by saying that, look, this shows that this commission was seen as a legitimate tool that, was used, and then I discuss from there. Yeah.
Well, I will follow actually upon your last remark. Did they were actually punished somehow? I mean, the Allied officers involved in that business of Schneidarex. Was there anything, any harm to them after that?
I have looked into two of the people involved, the British and the Americans. I don't think they were punished, but they were certainly investigated. And the first one is quite interesting. I think he's a major at the time, Major Crosfield, George Crosfield. He, if those have seen the talk by Dr. Beach, which is looking at a very similar topic, he notes he must have maybe not had time to explain it in his talk, but Crosfield actually went on to become a prominent position in the British, what would you call it, returned servicemen, so the British Legion of the ex-soldiers. And he was actually in charge for a good 10 years, I would say, maybe not officially in charge, but he was in charge of the foreign policy, so to speak. So basically, British former soldiers were trying to bring peace to Europe by making other connections to other soldiers. And the official organization was a French-dominated one. And Crosfield actually had a big commitment to try and reach out to the Germans as saying we should talk to our former enemies and so on. This is documented in some books on the British Legion by Niall Barr, actually, if anyone wants to read that. But the problem is that that's a very good policy until 1933, but then after Hitler comes to power, it's a problematic policy, and they still pursued this. So Crosfield is actually quite important in the British Legion in appeasement, basically. He doesn't want to. He was awarded a medal by the Czech authorities, and I've seen files in a Czech diplomat, Lisicki, whose files are in London. He was in touch, or vice versa. The Czechs were in touch with him a few days before the Munich Pact in end of September 1938, basically trying to see if he could do something or whatever. But anyway, I haven't looked into him any more than that. But he did have a prominent role in return servicemen, and he's in the British version of Who's Who, this collection of important people. So he's clearly doing all right. The second one I looked at was this Lieutenant Voska. I forget if this is the official American, or not official, but the American who's involved. But in the American archives, it's quite interesting. They note that this guy has a Czech surname, and he was, according to the American archives, the son of one of the American delegation. So they had, countless experts and so on. This Lieutenant Voska is clearly of Czech origin, and he's somehow got involved in this. And when the American investigator asked him questions, I think the quote is, he proudly showed them the cartridges of the bullets he fired at the Poles. So he was clearly very, very engaged in this. But as far as I can tell, there was no punishment brought to them, because I think everyone knew that the situation in January 1919 was so chaotic for all of the countries involved and for the Allies. They had no idea who was kind of where, and that's the main thing you get, is this sense that they were very disorganized. They really didn't quite know what was going on. So I think there's no record I could find that they were punished, really. I think they were just told, don't do it again. In fact, the French did issue an order saying to their soldiers that only you have to get approval from Paris before any commission. I didn't look at the French member, but the French diplomats did. They were outraged at the time. They said the pseudo commission and all these things, and the French did say, no, you can't have any more unofficial commissions. So, yeah.
Well, that was quite an interesting talk, and especially for me, the part about Arthur Voska. He was indeed the son of Emanuel Voska, quite a famous personality of Czechoslovak resistance against the Austro-Hungarian Empire in United States of America. And well, it's tremendously interesting that the remark upon the cartridges fired against the Polish soldiers.
I can send you the.
That would be perfect, indeed. Well, let's move now to the first Inter-Allied Commission, which were residing in Teschen. What can you tell us about the Commission in general, and maybe even about the relations between different part of the Commission, between, let's say, Italian, British, and French? Did they get along or not?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I don't know if I can add too much more to, if you've seen this video by Dr. Beach, his presentation, which I've seen just before I came, it does a very good job of explaining the Commission and so on. But I can add that so for my research, I've looked at the French files of the Commission and the American ones. I haven't, as well as the British. I haven't looked at the Italians, but I have looked at the published documents on Italian foreign policy, which mention TC, the Italian delegate. It's complicated, the relationships of the member of the Commission. I think I will start by talking about not within the Allies, but within each national delegation. There's actually a lot of tension, I would say. Starting with the Americans, the files are interesting in that first the Americans wanted to send a fairly high-ranking diplomat, Charles Seymour, who was an American scholar. I think he was in this inquiry, the Americans group that prepared for the peace conference. He backed out, and then at the same time they wanted two delegates, Charles Seymour, who knew a lot about Central Europe, and the one they did send, which was Marcus Coolidge. Marcus Coolidge is, in Roy's account, he paints him as a rather naive kind of businessman, and he definitely was to some extent. He was actually he had a machine tool business in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, which is a small town of, I looked it up, about 50,000 people now, so it must have been smaller back in the day. And he was also the mayor of this town, so he had some political skills, but he didn't speak any language besides English, so he was rather naive. His delegate, the secretary, was Arthur Dubois, who was a State Department official, who was much more knowledgeable, who spoke German, who kind of understood these things more. Quite early on, I think by March or April, Dubois is sending messages to the State Department saying, basically, Coolidge is not really very good. He doesn't have a good grasp of things, whatever. He should be replaced. So eventually he is. And the thing about Coolidge, which is interesting in the files, is it says one of the main criteria that he was chosen is that he was a close personal friend and supporter of President Wilson. So I think there's some nepotism to some extent. That's clearly why he was appointed. He may not have had other qualifications, really. At the same time, I just recently, these compiled Polish documents, which I've used Google Translate to see, published about the Rada Narodowa and their minutes and everything. One of these documents mentions Coolidge in a positive light and says, oh, he has a good grasp. So at least at some level, I think, early on, he could give the impression that he was knowledgeable about things, but I don't know. He didn't impress anyone in the Commission. Roy makes fun of him. They all didn't respect him very much. I mean, they respected him, but he didn't really have a grasp of what was going on. So he was replaced, and Dubois was pushing for this to happen. Dubois wanted to become the official representative, but the State Department refused. And then they sent George Howe, who is the second American delegate. He's a very fascinating guy. He's an architect by training, and there's a biography of him, about modern American architecture, and he, not an architect, but he apparently played some role in, developing in a modern American style and so on. But during the First World War, he was an intelligence official or intelligence officer. And just before coming to Teschen, he was posted to Bavaria, where he was basically looking into these Bolshevik kind of communist plots, coups, whatever you call it, in Bavaria. And he was a very international figure. He actually went to the same school, Groton, I think it's called, that Franklin Roosevelt went to. So very elite, prestigious, Northeast American school. He spoke French, German, maybe Italian, I don't know. He was a very cultured kind of guy. And he then doesn't like Dubois, so then he says like, Dubois is good, but eventually we want him to leave as well. So there's all sorts of tension between. Tell me if I'm speaking too much, because I'll just ramble on about these people for all night. Okay. Oh, good. I'm glad you find it interesting. Question about criteria. They did eventually, because they realized that not having criteria for these officials was disastrous. Like Coolidge wasn't very clever. But George Howe, they sent him because he was doing good work in Bavaria. He was very clever and clearly knew he traveled to Europe before the war, so he knew things a bit better. But he also has his prejudices. There's one document which is quite interesting. He writes, as all the commission did, in frustration at some point about being stuck between the Czechs and the Poles, constantly fighting, complaining, and he writes that about these reprisals, between each side doing something just to offend the other, and he says the commission has told them countless times that this shouldn't happen, whatever, but I think I'm paraphrasing, but it's a very close paraphrasing, but it is impossible to teach the semi-Oriental minds to learn better. So he clearly has some prejudices there, as I think all of the commission members did in their own way. And then the final member is this John Bass, who is mentioned in Roy's account as this kind of mysterious character. He is, no one's quite sure, like he was in Galicia earlier on with the kind of sending intelligence to the Americans about, I think he was a lieutenant, he was an aviator, he was a pilot, and he was there when the Inter-Allied Commission to Poland, which is sent at the same time as just before the Teschen Mission, sent to Warsaw to kind of manage these disputes between the Poles and Ukrainians and the Poles and the Germans over Poznan. He goes to Galicia and sends reports basically about the fighting and so on and so forth. Eventually, I haven't seen a record that says he's transferred, but eventually he just appears in Teschen and joins them. But he's quite intelligent, but the Americans again don't like him eventually. And George Howe eventually says that he has to go, Bass has to go. So there's lots of tensions within each group.
Sorry for interrupting. It was amazing that they discuss each other's sort of not possibilities, but power.
Yeah. Yeah. It's well, I mean.
What is the status of the commission?
Yeah. You mean between the different groups?
Between them, how can they actually interfere in each other's work?
They don't publicly. So these files, I think, are like, Howe is saying a confidential letter to the State Department saying, Dubois is good, but actually he's not great, and I want him to go.
So instead of them working on the problem of the Polish and Czech conflict, they are actually working in between each other about their own sort of feeling.
I mean, they're working on the conflict as well, obviously, but there is always enough time in any organization to criticize the people you work with. Like there's always, what is this? If there's three people, there's politics, kind of thing. So of course they were criticizing each other, but I mean, it's not like all the files were about each other. Most of the files were just about the conflict and so on and so forth.
If I can connect on the recent, things which you mentioned, you've obviously gone through tons of files and documents regarding the Inter-Allied Commission, and you already mentioned quite interesting frictions inside of the Commission. So could you highlight some interesting points, stories, or even curiosities? Because I am familiar with the James Roy book, but not all of our viewers might be. So if you can pick up some interesting stories and just highlight the probably most favorite for you.
Let me see. I mean, I won't mention the Roy ones because Roy leaves in June, but the one that for me in my master's thesis was the most interesting happens in about July or August, and and that led to a big dispute. So it was with Tisi, the Italian representative, and the commission had complained for constantly that the Czech patrols would stop their cars and kind of give them trouble, even though they're supposed to be this commission above them and so on. And one day, I think July or August, Tisi is out boar hunting. He's hunting, and he shoots a boar. He shoots a wild boar and is taking it back in his car, back to, I guess, the Braune Hirsch hotel where they're staying. But then the Czech patrol stop him, and they tell him, because of their ordinances, you can't take food past the lines. So I've got to double check. I'm not sure that they actually confiscate the boar, but there's a huge shouting match between Tisi and I forget which Czech officer, but there's a report by Blaha and a counter report by Tisi, and where they're slightly different reports, but basically Tisi explodes, and clearly a lot of pent up anger, and I think he shouts something like he doesn't give a expletive, swear word, and he swears at them and so on, and this basically ends the relationship the Czechs have with Tisi. It's kind of ruined, basically. So, and this is in July or August. By this point, the Americans leave in August. The whole Paris conference because America won't sign the treaty, there's an order that they should all kind of leave Europe. So Howe leaves in August, late July or August. Tisi is now persona non grata with the Czechs, and then the Poles distrust Marshall, the second French representative after Grenade goes. And, I should say on his part, they don't trust him, not because he's done anything, but because of this whole really complex world of the French military mission is in Prague, and training the Czechoslovak soldiers and kind of leading them with officers and so on. And Marshall, his boss, is technically in the French military mission. I think he officially is as well. So the Poles say, well, this French representative is actually part of the Czech army in a way, because he's, in that kind of operation. So they basically say, well, we can't trust Marshall because he's linked to the French officers in Prague. So by August, the only one that they vaguely kind of trust is Pakenham Walsh, the second British one. And he writes in his letters his one phrase where he says that he's the golden boy, the golden-haired boy or something between both sides, because he's the only one that doesn't have an obvious hatred towards him. But Tisi especially, the Czechs, I think, for good reason, loathed him. It's hard to say. I haven't found any real accounts by him, but in the published Italian sources, they acknowledge that the Czechs don't like him. They do say that in October there's an account. In October there's some statement that says it seems like the press kind of agitation against Tisi is subsided. So it seems like there's not as much hostility to Tisi in October, but I don't know. But yeah, this incident with the boar is quite funny and quite caused this big dispute. This similar incidents, even in December 1919, there's a report that Pakenham Walsh's driver is stopped and harassed by Czech soldiers, and so these kind of things were happening all the time, and clearly added to the level of frustration that they felt. I mean, they didn't enjoy that at all.
Well, now a question which to some extent still stirs waters of Czech and Polish historiography. It's the question of war crimes and atrocities committed during the conflict, during the actual war, and after the armistice. So, did actually the Inter-Allied Commission investigated this or collected any evidence about the war crimes committed during the conflict? Do you know something about it? Did you encounter some sources speaking about it?
Yeah, it's a good question. Unfortunately, the answer would be no. I haven't seen anything I'm definitely clear I haven't seen anything about the conflict. Maybe there's a few reports they send, but the problem is that the commission isn't charged with, it's not a commission of inquiry about the conflict. It's a commission to stop the fighting, implement this 3rd of February agreement, which is about, keeping infringements, preventing infringements, keeping coal supplies being sent to Poland from the coal mines, and preparing reports on the future of the duchy. So they don't really deal with the January war. But in terms of, you wouldn't call them war crimes because technically it wasn't a war, but there's constant conflict between the Poles and the Czechs from, all the way until after the place is split, in 1920. But especially during the Commission's time, there's a lot of documentation on, from February 12th, from when they arrive onwards, there's lots of reports about infringements on the neutral zone that is set up. I've seen one in the files, where Schneidarek sends a file saying, like, this is a report of maltreatment of a Czech soldier. There's lots of reports of maltreatment of Polish soldiers back at. They all send, constant memoranda. The French archives are probably the best for this. They're the most complete that I've seen in the Archives Diplomatiques in Nantes. The French split their archive, so that section is in Nantes. There's files are full. The French kept very detailed dossiers, and there's several files on arrests, people arrested, and then they look into them and try and release them and so on. There's a large number of files on the military issues, each infringement of the neutral zone. I can give one example which I looked at recently, which is in May or June. There was a skirmish at, they always use the German names, Polnisch Leuten. I'm not quite sure where this is in today's terms, but... oh, okay, good. They, Parkiem and Walsh, it's in the French files as well as British, but Parkiem and Walsh is somehow the one on duty who receives this complaint. It gets a complaint that from the Poles that the Czechs infringed the neutral zone, and they say, well, and that meant we had to fire on them, and then the Czechs complain that, well, we were fired on by the Poles and so on. Parkiem and Walsh goes to investigate on the spot, and he hears the same factual account, which is that at 11 a.m. shooting started, or the Czechs advanced to the neutral zone, the Poles opened fire, then it died down, then at 1 p.m. it started again, and that 2 civilians were killed, and 1 boy was injured. And it's interesting looking at these different accounts, but it's basically quite tragic. It's hard to get the truth for what is happening, but basically it seems that there's a house in the neutral zone, which the Czechs claim was, the civilians were patriotic Czechs, and this boy was wearing like a Czech soldier's hat, and 2 people in the house were killed by the same bullet, it says, so they were somehow shot through the thing, and then this boy was somehow wounded in the side, and apparently that the Czechs claim that the Poles went into the house, basically, or started shouting at a woman in the house, accusing her of, having low morality, some offensive words, whatever, and then the Czechs came. It's very hard to piece these together, and Parkiem and Walsh says the Czechs were wrong to go into the neutral zone, but the Poles were also wrong to open fire, and this is repeated constantly, and you've got lots of accounts of little things like this where, it's hard to say it was a war detour. So the main argument of my master's thesis, and to some extent this article I'm preparing shortly on the commission, is that this struggle for their authority, they realize they're called, the Inter-Allied Commission of Control, and they very quickly realize that they cannot control anything because they have no troops of their own. All they have is their moral authority, and that's pretty questionable in times, especially because they're always getting drunk in the hotel and everything, which doesn't help. But they realize being impartial and neutral is the best thing they can do, and then they don't do a very good job of that, TC and others. So they have a real struggle to kind of do this. In March, there is a diplomatic effort to where the Paris Peace Conference says to Prague and Warsaw, you must grant the Commission complete control over the duchy. And this is an official thing, and the Poles agree, and then the Czechs say they agree, and then they refuse to ratify it. So, I mean, they don't have any control. So it's like very difficult for them to figure out. But at the same time, you can say their presence there was constant. So both sides knew that everything they were doing was being reported back to Paris. So that's kind of this maybe peacekeeping, more peace observation kind of role.
Yeah. Well,
But just wanted to say that they try to be most neutral they could, but investigating, they find some contradictory reports. They contradict each other, so they couldn't actually do much about it. And they sort of were boasting about how neutral they were and how little knowledge they had about this part of Europe. Yeah, and it was supposed to help them. And did it help? And then did they come up with some comparison between Poles and Czechs? Staying here for some time yet, did they come up with some opinions and some different opinions?
Yeah, so Roy especially, this quote of his, our very ignorance means we are impartial, something like this. It's hard to say on each, because so when it comes to military incidents, that's a Czech-Polish kind of issue. And there, there's a quote in the archive that they literally say, both sides tell us that each other was to blame, and they admit that they find it very difficult, if not impossible, to get any real conclusion. So with those incidents, it's very hard. And I think they're fairly neutral when it comes to these military incidents. Also because there's nothing they can really do about it. But when it comes to writing their reports, which is the other issue of their work, that's slightly different. They're very pro-Czech in the beginning. I think Dr. Beach's presentation mentioned this as well. They're very pro-Czech in the beginning because the Czechs they have the best troops, most well-ordered and so on. They're very impressed by this and that they can prevent Bolshevism and all these kind of things. Then the commission, with the exception of Grenard and maybe Marshall, but it's hard to say, become more pro-Polish. And this is mainly because on the one hand, they do gain more information on the ethnographic details. So they say, well, actually, the duchy as a whole is more Polish than Czech. And I think they're also increasingly frustrated by the Czech side, by Schneidarek, who they have this tense relationship with. They admire him, but they're always frustrated by him, and they kind of hate him to some extent. But while secretly admiring him, I mean, it's And Coulson, when he goes to Prague to be the military attaché, he recommends that Schneidarek be given an award, a medal, because although he says something, although he caused us a lot of trouble in Teschen, he's a brave soldier, and so on and so forth. So there's a tension between them. Coulson also goes to Slovakia, I think, I'm not sure with Schneidarek, but observes, it might be this battle that Schneidarek conducts against the Hungarians, but he's there in June writing reports about that, one of which was seen by Lord George. It's in the Prime Minister's office, so one of his reports at least made it high up. What else was I going to say? Impartiality and so on. I don't know how the Italian, from one file I've seen in the Italian published documents, it shows that they're a little partial, shall we say, because there was one thing the commission was tasked with doing, which wasn't in its original job description, was in March and April, the Czechoslovak government complained that there was a German plot against them, against the government, whatever. And for whatever reason, the Teschen Commission was charged, probably because they were nearby, were charged to investigate this plot. And they went to Prague, or at least Coulson and a few others, and Coolidge and so on, maybe TC as well. They went, Grenard actually went to Prague to investigate. They found that there was no plot. There were some disaffected nobles and Germans, but there was no real plot to overthrow the Czechoslovak state. But the Italian document mentions that, I'm paraphrasing a lot, but it basically says that you should bear in mind that you don't want to do anything that supports the Czechoslovak state so much. So that's a rough paraphrasing. I have to find that document again, but that is the closest I found to kind of an instruction to one of the delegates to say, don't support one of the other two sides or something. So I've never found anything that the British don't. There was no overt instructions. Diplomatically, the French, Grenard was certainly convinced that more of the mining district should go to the Czechs and so on. After the first report, which called for independent, neutral Teschen and so on, Grenard says to Paris in his dispatch that he admits that the ethnographic claims of the Poles are greater and so on, but he says, it's more important that we give this to the Czechs and so on. So he clearly is a little more biased. But,
Well, you've already kind of mentioned it, but to which extent were the members of the Inter-Allied Commission under political pressure, for example, from locals or local officials regarding the constant reports of violences and brutalities of each side, and whether they were more under this kind of political pressure from the local politicians or from the big names of Czechoslovak and Polish diplomacy, which were actually at the time in Versailles, or in general from the diplomats residing in Versailles at the time?
Yeah, that's a very good question. How can I answer it? So the first thing is that there's a very interesting document in the American archives, which from George Howe, it's just a standard report. I think it's from April, mid-April or something. It's about the time that they issue their kind of second report, so to speak, where they give a whole different set of recommendations about how to deal with the dispute, which are more pro-Polish, more pro-ethnographic. And one of the things he says is that tension is really getting to a really high point, and that there may even be threats to the life of the commission, and that so they were beginning to want to think that we have no troops of our own, we can be a target of some attack, and he links it and he says basically that was also because there was a rumor that the Poles had heard that Paris was about to agree to the split to give the Czechs more of the coal mine. So basically what was happening in Paris, the commission felt was a direct threat to their safety. So that's kind of interesting in that it's not a direct answer to the question, but they did feel pressure from what was going on in the ground. They felt that they were very exposed, which they were. If one side or the other really wanted to get rid of them, they could easily do so. So yeah, potential decisions in Paris could have a repercussion on them, on their safety in Teschen. What was the other? Was it about local politics per se? I think as Dr. Beach's presentation that I saw, they more of them spoke German. So of course, in the town itself, they were kind of sympathizing with the Germans. But once, and they pushed very hard, the Americans as well, for this independent, neutral. Dubois is really pushing for it. And before the report, early on, even Coolidge, almost within a week of their arrival, they're pushing for this idea of a neutral, independent Teschen. After that, it's rejected by Paris in March, end of March, April, whatever. They may socialize with the Germans more, but they know there's no hope that they're going to get anything. So I don't think, in some sense, it doesn't really matter, I suppose, that they're maybe pro-German. The Germans were said to be more pro-Czech, but I think only grudgingly. They weren't enthusiastically pro-Czech. In a related incident, one of the other things which the commission was Germans from other Sudetenland went to the commission and said, "Can you investigate our incidents? This shooting in Liobschutz or so on." The commission asked Paris, "Should we go and investigate this?" And they were told, "No, don't investigate that." So, they were, I guess, seen as a source of hope from other Sudeten Germans. But they didn't. In the end, the commission was unable, or Paris was unwilling to let them help them, so to speak.
Well, I think that now it's excellent time for other participants of the discussion. So do you have actually, Stanislav have...
Ask about something. Could you tell us about sources which reported when the commission did and the influence had lost influence to solve the problem of Cieszyn dispute?
It's more of a question of when they ever had any influence, because it's interesting, and this is actually something that is unrelated to the Poles or the Czechs or whatever, but the very structure of the peace conference and the very nature of their mission, I think, undermined them from the very start. So I'll explain. The Teschen Commission was created by the Inter-Allied Commission of Poland, which is this commission established by the peace conference in maybe 2 days before or something, maybe a day or two after the war starts.
The decision was accepted on the 3rd of February, and he arrived. Arrived at 12th of February.
But the issue is that not the timing so much, but the issue is that what causes a problem is that this first commission, and my whole research is commission, so it's like there's commissions bloody everywhere this time, and no one to this day can keep track of them, because during the peace conference, the peacemakers used commissions kind of to deal with problems that they were too busy with. So they just created commissions, and no one really knows how many were created during the peace conference. So they created this commission, which then was given the job of dealing with the Teschen issue, and then that commission created the Teschen Commission. It said, we should create a second commission to deal with this. The problem is that the Teschen Commission, with all of, Roy, Coulson, and so on, they felt they were independent. They felt they were a separate commission, whereas this first commission said, no, we're in charge of you. So they have this internal power struggle, and this becomes a problem in the end of February when these two generals, Niesel and Romé, come from this first commission, because the Teschen Commission hadn't managed to get the Czechs to leave the town until, by the end of February, the Czechs were still in occupation of the town of Teschen, and the agreement said they should leave and the Poles should come in. And this first commission, the Inter-Allied Commission on Poland, is angry. They says, you are letting the Czechs, flout our control, ignore our authority. So they send two of their own generals to Teschen to sign this agreement on the 25th or something of February, something like 27th, at the end of February, and order the Czechs to leave, and then tell the Teschen Commission, you have to carry this out, whatever. So the Teschen Commission, there's bitter complaints sent to Paris saying, you've humiliated us in the town we're in. Basically, now everyone knows that we have no authority and that this other commission is telling us what to do. So they feel like they have no authority. They also say that it undermines their impartiality, which is a good point they make, regardless of how else they behaved. But the Czechs see this as it's called the Inter-Allied Commission on Poland. So this commission that's dealing with Poland, which has a reputation of being pro-Polish, of siding with the Polish point of view, has now told this supposedly neutral Teschen Commission what to do. So then the Czechs take this idea that, this commission is not neutral because they're following actually what this Polish commission is doing. So within a month of 2 weeks of their arrival, they already have a lot of prestige that they've lost. So, it's difficult for them, and they write very bitter complaints, and not just, like Roy mentions this, but it's not just Americans complain. The French, even Grenade, who is pro-Czech, complains bitterly about this other commission that's telling us what to do. Everyone is complaining, so the commission feels humiliated for this. So that's one issue where they don't have much authority, and then they struggled to gain authority. In March, April, they sent to the peacemakers to tell Prague and Warsaw to follow the orders of the Teschen Commission, but this was never ratified by Prague, so they never really had any great authority. But they always had the sense that they were officers or they were representatives of the Allies. So as long as the question was not resolved, they were somehow important. But this is the other question, is that their two main tasks are contradictory, if you think about it. So they're told on the one hand to stop the fighting and keep the peace between the Poles and the Czechs, which is good, and they discover the best way to do this is if they're being impartial. But their other job is to recommend the future of the duchy, which means that they're not neutral. It means they're actually potentially very powerful. So it means that one way or the other, their decision will not be neutral. And I think that's also why they recommend this idea for this neutral, independent state, because otherwise they have to side with the Poles or the Czechs, which makes it much harder for them to then act as a neutral body to keep the peace. So I don't know.
What you know about the members of this commission, where each other leave the town, the Cieszyn?
You mean what was their life like here, or when did they? What time did they leave?
They left.
Oh, right. Very different times, so it's a bit of a mess for some of them. Grenade left mid-April. He was never very. He's one that is worth looking more into. He was the consul general in Moscow for France beforehand, before the revolution, I presume. But he was also a ethnographer and travel writer. So he wrote a book about visiting Tibet and all these things. So very interesting guy with lots of different things. But I've seen his archives in Paris. He had there's nothing on Teschen there. There's some things on Russia, maybe one brief document about Central Europe or something, but he didn't I think have much interest in the assignment in Teschen. So he left in April and was replaced by Marshall, his deputy. Then the Americans, Coolidge leaves by April, is kicked out, or even earlier. Howe leaves in end of July or early August. Then TC, as far as I can tell, stays at least until December, if not all the way through, I think, till the plebiscite commission came in the very end of January 1920. And Roy leaves in middle of June, who's the sub-level of the British delegates. Coulson leaves in middle of May. Packen and Walsh stays till the very end. And his letters are very charming. He writes, about his travels. He seems to have made any excuse to visit Prague, Warsaw, Vienna, just because he's so bored. And he loves hunting. And one of his letters is in December. It's like -20, he says, and he's still hunting. He shot 4 rabbits or something like this. I mean, he's very impressed by this. But one of his last letters is dated, or when he writes the date, it's December already. He says that Teschen still. So he's still in Teschen. He's not happy to be here. But his very last letter in this booklet, it's not letters, it's like carbon copy paper. So he was such an orderly man that he wrote letters to his relatives at home with carbon paper beneath so he could keep a copy. So there's this copy, which is brilliant. I thought, I might start doing this. This is great. But the last one it's a really touching moment. He comes back from a visit to Vienna on New Year's Eve, 1919, and he says the town is something like it was the merriest spot in Europe of all this time. Poles drinking slivovitz and Germans drinking beer, and everyone was friendly and like dancing together. So under the influence of a lot of alcohol, everyone was happy in the town. He doesn't mention the Czechs, so I don't know, maybe they weren't, but presumably they were getting drunk as well at some point. He left shortly after. He stayed until a few days after the new commission came, and except for Harris, who is this British secretary from the Foreign Office who wears the military uniform, he stays with the plebiscite commission. So he stays in Teschen basically from early 1919 all the way through presumably May, June 1920. So he's there for a while.
Thanks.
So, yeah, okay.
Do they always refer to the name of the town as Teschen? Is it any other versions of the name of the town ever?
The commission themselves seem to only refer to it as Teschen, but which I'm trying to think of which documents I've seen. It's not necessarily the case. So the French military mission in Prague, they are, I guess, because they're basically part of the government in some sense. They're either not officially part of the Czechoslovak government, but they refer to it as Teschin. I think the French military who was kind of embedded or whatever you call it in the Polish army, I think they refer to it as Cieszyn. So, but the commission itself, as far as I could tell, uses Teschen, the German name, and that's really the main one you see in the documents. Even the French documents, mainly Teschen, the German form. Yeah.
You want to continue? Oh.
One more.
Yeah.
Can we go to the second commission? Well, no. Just. I mean, if you could compare the first one, which was it? Sorry for the stupid question. Was it completely sort of hopeless, the first one, as far as the mission is concerned, compared to the second one? If you could compare them.
I mean, they're very different commissions, obviously, with different tasks. But the first commission, I mean, it's sad to say hopeless, but I would say that, as I was saying earlier, no, I do too. And in my master's thesis, I was probably a little too sympathetic, I think. My point was like, they've been overlooked and it's not fair, and like, because some of the few things, at least in English language historians dealing with the Teschen dispute, the commission is, a tiny role, and then those who do mention it, they're very dismissive, which is fair enough to some extent, because, fine, what did they really accomplish? But the main thing they accomplished was that, and okay, you can't 100% say this was the commission's responsible role, but there was no outbreak of a second war, and I feel the officials themselves pointed to this, like the members of the commission felt that they had a role in doing this. There's a member of the British military who writes that, the commission has done a good job in keeping the peace and so on. And even Lloyd George, when he makes this infamous statement, which Dr. Beach mentioned at the beginning of his talk, how many of you in Parliament have heard of Teschen? What's almost never cited is that the rest of his kind of talk about this, when he mentions Teschen, he said, in many places like Teschen, paraphrasing, we've had to send commissions to basically keep the situation under control until Paris could deal with the problem. So based on that own criteria, they were successful to some extent, because they at least managed to prevent, a bigger fighting. And I mean, it's not like the possibility wasn't there. I mean, I don't know. You know the situation better than I do, but look what happened in Poland's eastern borders. I mean, fighting with Ukraine and Lithuania and so on. I mean, it was potential that this could have dragged on much worse. So I don't know. That being said, they did send this commission to kind of observe what was happening in Galicia, and they did, send a commission. I guess it was under the League of Nations early on to Vilno and everything to deal with that. So I would argue they succeeded kind of despite themselves. Certainly the commission, the jobs they were given, as I mentioned, were contradictory, so that didn't help. They had a lot of trouble. There were a lot of things that were outside of their control. At the same time, they made their own mistakes. I mean, like, they seemed to be really like, tissy and everything. I mean, like, if your job is to be a kind of diplomatic person, you don't start swearing at one side and everything. And so they clearly made mistakes. They drank far too much, probably. I don't know, it's my guess. They enjoyed themselves quite a bit. So the second commission, which was your question. So the plebiscite commission, it's much simpler in a way, even though it's didn't work and everything. But their instructions are much simpler, which is basically hold a plebiscite. Full stop. Keep the peace until you hold the plebiscite. You're given, 1,300 troops or something. The members of that commission were, I think, exclusively diplomats or people, because they had military troops, they didn't need to be soldiers themselves. So the British member, Wilton, he I don't know if it was very helpful, but his training was in China. He was the consul general in Chengdu in China, and I don't know if that's helpful or not, but he had some diplomatic training, quite a lot, in a Chinese context. The British, he was the British. The French was career diplomat de Maneville. He was, a count. He was very cultured and so on. Borsarelli, I think, is the Italian one. He was, I think, also a politician or somehow and then Yamada, the Japanese one, he was a legal scholar, studied in Berlin. So I'm tempted to say they're more respectable people, which is mean to the commission, but as in they maybe took their jobs a bit more seriously. I don't know. But again, I haven't come across any. I've seen correspondence of Wilton to the British, not ambassador because it was only a legation, but the British representative in Warsaw, Rumbold. I mean, he's stressed and everything. He doesn't like what's going on, but there's no indication, and he's writing to his boss to some extent, so he wouldn't mention, I got drunk late at night, obviously, but the thing that they correspond about to some letters is stamp collecting. So, I mean, it's like there are different, because it's interesting, these special stamps produced by the plebiscite districts, which I would love to find one day, but the British ambassador or Rumbold basically says, oh, by the way, could you send me a copy of this, whatever, my collection, and I'll pay you back, don't worry. Were they? Oh, excellent. There's another anecdote from another commission in the plebiscite in Marienwerder in German, East Prussia up north, where they had these other two plebiscites above Upper Silesia. Anyway, the plebiscite stamp there was produced by the Italian representative, demanded that someone he knows should produce them back in Italy, and there's this whole correspondence or some mention about this that they produced it and then they got it back, and he was very embarrassed that the Italians had screwed it up, and it was smudges and they ruined these plebiscite stamps and they had to get it redone or something. So it's interesting. All these plebiscites had their own stamps, and I've seen a report. This is getting on what time is it? This is going on a tangent all night about plebiscite stamps. But there's a report, the Foreign Office, by someone who was on one of these commissions in Eastern Prussia about the plebiscite, mentions the plebiscite stamps, that they were hugely popular but apparently they had no value in 1944. Nowadays, I don't know. Maybe they're worth something. If you have them, you should hold on to them. I don't know.
Well, I think we can now conclude where we began, actually. We'll get a little bit personal again. There are not many historians on Czech or Polish side, but outside of Central European region, who actually deals with that kind of a problem. And from what you told us today, it's clear that you attained a high degree of expertise in this question. So how difficult it is actually researching Central European border dispute question from your point, because in a kind of a pre-interview which we done, you said you mentioned that you are kind of a global nomad, that you travel a lot. So, well, to some extent, it might be even an advantage because you visit a lot of places, a lot of archives all around the world. So, is it an advantage or a disadvantage?
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad that I could contribute something to people interested in this topic. Yeah, let me think about that. My biggest regret is that my Polish and my Czech is not very good, because this would be wonderful, different insights on the Commission and so on. But for dealing with, the international diplomacy of it and the Commission, French and English are the main ones you need. Because I'm based in Hong Kong, and very loosely I can use this term, I'm doing the PhD there, but I'm also traveling around a lot. I have a Hong Kong scholarship, which is very nice, so that has been helpful. Fund a lot of my trip, not all, but most of my research. I don't think it's been a problem. It's mean that you have to pay attention with logistics a lot more. So if you're going on a relatively expensive, but airfare is a bit cheaper now, thankfully, than before. You're going away for a month, and you need to do as much research in advance about which files you want to see and so on. That's the main thing to do. I mean, and it's just cumulative as well. So there's always some horrible things where you realize that, there's another file there in that archive you just visited and just left, but you haven't seen it, and you go, oh, Christ, okay. If you have a chance to go back, depends. But like the British archives are wonderful in terms of very accessible and very friendly. Nice cafe, nice restaurant, all these things. The French archives was not as fun, I would say. They're very nice. They work great, but my reading of French is fine, but my spoken French is, like many historians, I suppose, who can read, it's a bit harder. So, but that's part of the adventure. I think you just have to. For me, it's part of the excitement. Is you go to these places and like. Maybe you embarrass yourself in front of the archivist, but you get what you want eventually. So, I don't know. It's been good. It's been, and then it's been. I deliberately. So why I'm in Czeshin is that I deliberately decided that I would write while I'm writing up my thesis. I would visit the places I write about, these disputes, and I had been very briefly to Czeshin for my master's thesis in 2011, but just for a few hours and just to see the town basically. And I thought, it's very nice, so I'll stay here for a few weeks and write. And I go off to other places as well. I spent 2 weeks in Saarbrücken in the next few weeks, which they had, obviously, as you know, a plebiscite there in 1935 and another one in 1955. I mean, I hear that it's a pretty boring post-industrial town, but why not visit it, write my thesis from the spot? It has its advantages.
Well, Andrew, thank you again very much. It was a great pleasure. I think I speak on behalf of all of us. It was a really great time with you here in Skoczowie, where the war terminated. And thank you again for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me and for your interest. Thank you very much.